This is the 2019 Supreme Court March Madness. In the Constitutional Conference, we have Marbury versus Madison taking on 8th seeding Engel versus Vitale. We believe Marbury versus Madison is moving on with the establishment of judicial review, which is more important than Engel versus Vitale ruling school prayers unconstitutional. Next, Dred Scott versus Sanford goes against U.S. versus Lopez. We predict an upset since both cases have not significantly changed future ways, but Dred Scott versus Sanford will pull through as its decision was more important during its time period with slaves unable to become citizens, and U.S. versus Lopez ruled that the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 was unconstitutional. Since Marbury versus Madison set a precedent, it then eliminates Dred Scott versus Sanford. Gitlow versus New York is eliminated by U.S. versus Nixon, stating that the First Amendment also applies to state government. However, this was not as important as U.S. versus Nixon since that case ruled nothing can sustain absolute presidential privilege. Finally, we have McCulloch versus Maryland up against Gibbons versus Ogden. McCulloch versus Maryland moved on by defining the scope of U.S. Congress's legislative power, which is more significant than Gibbons versus Ogden, stating power to regulate interstate commerce encompassed power to regulate navigation. We predict an upset between U.S. versus Nixon against McCulloch versus Maryland because both were important in shaping the powers of the three branches, but McCulloch versus Maryland would take the victory since it related to the powers of American legislatures. In the Bill of Rights Conference, we have Tinker versus Des Moines as 8th seeding because it made no significant change and only reiterated the importance of the First Amendment. It is eliminated by first seeding New York Times versus Sullivan, which states that a statement of a public figure is not enough to show it is false for the press to be libel. Texas versus Johnson invalidated prohibitions burning the U.S. flag, a state law that was enforced by 48 of the 50 states. And Gideon versus Wainwright ruled that court states must provide an attorney for defendants in criminal cases who are unable to afford an attorney. This was a very close match since both clarified and in a way strengthened the amendments, but Gideon versus Wainwright claims victory because it also extended the right to counsel. New York Times versus Solon defeats Gideon versus Wainwright matchup because its ruling prevented reports from being intervened. New York Times versus U.S. allowed newspapers to post the then-classified Pentagon Papers with risk of government punishment, while Schenck versus U.S. ruled that freedom of speech can be restricted if their words represented a clear and present danger. We predict an upset because both clarified understandings of the First Amendment, but New York Times versus U.S. will move on since it defended freedom of the press against prior restraint by the government. Finally, we have District of Columbia versus Heller against Matt versus Ohio. Both are extremely important cases, created in a close game. Matt versus Ohio states evidence obtained in violation against Fourth Amendment cannot be used in court, but District of Columbia versus Heller will pull through as held by the Second Amendment, individuals have the right to possess a firearm, a topic still important today. District of Columbia versus Heller will defeat New York Times versus U.S. because it was the first case to decide if the Second Amendment protects an individual's rights to keep arms for self-defense.
In the Civil Rights Conference, our first-place seeding, Plessy v. Ferguson, overruled our 8th seeding, Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States, because Plessy v. Ferguson would have led to more decisions based upon civil rights in the future. Roe v. Wade ruled that a state law that banned abortions was unconstitutional, and the ruling made abortion legal in many circumstances, whereas in Griswold v. Connecticut, the court ruled that a married couple has the right to use contraceptives. Roe v. Wade defeated Griswold v. Connecticut due to its ongoing prevalence in today's society, where the right for a woman to have an abortion is still a controversial topic. Plessy v. Ferguson won against Roe v. Wade because it was a major turning point in the United States during this time and led to future historical legislation. Brown v. Board of Education ruled upon the fact that establishing separate public schools for black and white students was unconstitutional, and Regents of the University of California v. Bake upheld affirmative action. Brown v. Board of Education overruled Regents of the University of California v. Bake because it showed that racial segregation violated the 14th Amendment in the Constitution and created an equal opportunity for education. In Loving v. Virginia, the court ruled that banning interracial marriage was unconstitutional. Obergefell v. Hodges ruled that state bans on same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. It was a close matchup between these cases because both pertain to the Equal Protection Clause and the 14th Amendment, yet Loving v. Virginia won because it greatly minimized racial segregation and discrimination. Brown v. Board of Education won against Loving v. Virginia because it helped end segregation in public schools and was extremely important in the growth of the United States.
In the Political Process Conference, we have 8th seeding Bush versus Gore up against Miranda versus Arizona. Bush versus Gore is 8th seeding because many claim that its decision revolving around the issue of time is poor, and time should be insubstantial when constitutional rights are at stake. It is defeated by Miranda versus Arizona, requiring the suspect's rights to be advised prior to interrogation. Next, we have Shelby County versus Holder against Korematsu versus U.S. Shelby County versus Holder declared Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 unconstitutional by imposing current burdens no longer responsive to the current conditions in voting districts in question, and defeats Korematsu versus U.S., which upheld the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Miranda versus Arizona defeats Shelby County versus Holder because its decision is more significant to modern day for interrogation of suspects. Baker versus Carr goes against Buckley versus Valeo, stating limits on election spending is unconstitutional. This was a close match, but Baker versus Carr considers a larger overview of state reapportionment claims justiciable in federal court, so it moves on. Finally, we have Citizens United versus FCC against Lemon versus Kurtzman, which created a Lemon test. Citizens versus FEC states that free speech prohibits government from restricting independent expenditures for communications by corporations, allowing to move on. Baker versus Carr is eliminated by Citizens United versus FEC in a close match since Citizens United versus FEC was more specific on spendings of corporations. In our final four, we have Marbury versus Madison matched up against New York Times versus Sullivan, and Plessy versus Ferguson against Miranda versus Arizona. Marbury versus Madison defeats New York Times versus Sullivan, while Plessy versus Ferguson moves on since the decision had a significant impact during its specific time period. Lastly, we have Marbury versus Madison claiming ultimate victory against Plessy versus Ferguson since judicial review is one of the checks and balances in the separation of powers and what makes the courts review all these cases.